This is Lecture 385-23, Controlled and Profane Language. Before 1500, it was more often than not a member of the clergy or someone otherwise employed by a religious organization or just someone at the most prestigious and most learned levels of society who was responsible for the inscription, copying, and curation and preservation of texts. The farther away from the muck you get, the farther away from work with your hands you get, the more likely it is that you have someone who has a direct role in preserving, copying, curating, and inscribing texts. For all their grandness of scope, the MED and the OED have built their historical and etymological lexicon on a series of choices of personal preference. Preferences that were held by the most learned and most backward-looking, necessarily, speakers and writers of early English, and then choices and preferences that were mainly decided by early modern and later curators and preservers and retainers or throwers away of those texts. Do you think that the preferences and values held by the group of scribes, copyists, preservationists, and curators on whom we rely for our data were representative of a cross-section of English as it was actually used, both in speech and in writing, whether that writing survived or was thrown away? Or do you think we might have a word-to-world fit problem on our hands here at the lexical and semantic level too? Is it worth asking what words and what conversations get left out of standard discourse? What gets left out of written discourse as opposed to spoken discourse? What happens when nearly all our evidence of past practices in English is written? And how does that, the fact that all of the information we have to rely on about past lexicon and semantics has been curated by and filtered through the most learned, the most backward-looking, past-looking people, generally the most sort of prestigious and proper people after the fact? How does that, right, the fact that the past we're looking at is based on data that was curated, affect the fundamental way that we understand the past, and particularly the pre-modern past? Where can we turn to try to correct for word-to-world fit here? This is one of my favorite lecture topics. Here I turn to the history of controlled and profane language, S-word, F-word, man parts, lady parts, and slurs, as a way of making such a correction, of trying to retrain our eyes to account for the contingencies of how a historical lexicon or dictionary is even made. This lecture will also provide my answer to any students who have asked why I fucking curse in my classes and why I encourage free use of profanity as essential to an understanding of linguistic history and in my other classes of dramatic history. It's serious shit. Indeed, let's start with the S word. This is my own research. I hate to be that prof, but this is me quoting my own research. This is from my book, came out last year. Sorry. And here I'm researching the various surviving manuscripts of a passion play in northwestern England, where the crucifixion of Jesus is performed by local tradesmen in public gathering places. These are all ages shows. 4 copies of the play have Jesus' tormentors saying, and here, right here where it says line 66, have Jesus' tormentors saying they'll torture him even if it makes him groan and shriek. But one copy, which I argue in my book is the earliest version, has them torture him even if he should piss and shit, right here, line 67. That's because, and here I'm quoting Hughes' Encyclopedia of Swearing from 2006, the word shit, here at the red arrow, the word shit, not an especially taboo term in medieval English, took on an increasingly taboo quality, often as a term of abuse or as a conspicuously censored term, starting in the 16th century. The idea that shit is a bad word only starts then. Based on that information, I can argue that the 4 copies that say groan and shriek most likely come from a later version that was Bowdlerized. To bowdlerize is when someone comes along and not only censors a text, but changes a text, perhaps imperceptibly to later readers, by omitting or modifying words or passages that that person considers indelicate or offensive. In this case, by some early modern copyist after the year 1500, offended by the medieval original. Because in Middle English, before 1500, there was nothing offensive or indelicate about the word shit. There are obviously certain situations in which it would be more appropriate to talk about feces than in others, right? On a date, not a good time. But there is no distinction for Middle English speakers among the available words that refer to feces. The words shit, poop, feces, stool, solid excrement, these all refer to the same thing, something that everyone does. Think about how commonsensical it is for you to register some of those words I've just said as indelicate, as inappropriate to say in a university class, and some as acceptable. Not because of what is being referred to, the actual shit, but because of the connotations attached to each word. Where and when do those connotations get attached? The polite, medical-sounding feces enters English as, you guessed it, a Latin borrowing that shifts, at least in OED sense 2. Right here it's in some use before 1475, but with a different meaning. In OED sense 2, it begins to mean excrement during, you guessed it, the early modern period, ante 1625. As for the word excrement, which is the only word that the OED has available to say what the word means, that is also an early modern Latin borrowing via French. But the word shit is as old as English itself. Of course it is, because we've been shitting the whole time. So that when Chaucer's most pious character, his parson, right, this is one of the pilgrims on the way to Canterbury, when the parson is speaking about how important it is for the clergy to behave well, because it doesn't mean much to have clean sheep if you've got a shitten shepherd. Here, a shitten shepherd and a clean sheep. A shepherd that's stained with shit. There's no perceivable tonal shift that's happening here. The parson, who also happens to be rural, a bit of an uplander, simply tells it like it is. To an audience that in the tale involves prestigious listeners and in real life involved the highest class of prestigious listeners. Now, in contrast, we teach our children that certain words must never be spoken. Don't even talk about it and never say that word in front of your teacher, in front of your grandparents, in front of me. Never with that word. No wonder that gastrointestinal shame and its associated medical problems with the gastrointestinal system are so prevalent among children that we actually need to read them a book that assures them, yes, everyone poops. And what about the F word, which we are never to utter in front of any child, let alone talk about what the word refers to, keeping in mind that medieval people... Oh, sorry, this is the wrong slide. Haha, this is still shit. Shit. There we go. The F word. Keeping in mind, right, that medieval people who were not so alienated from the sources of their food and their cloth that they never saw a cow or a sheep or a pig could never and would never shield anyone from the biological realities of shitting and fucking that such animals make unavoidably visible. When I first started teaching this class in the history of the English language, the OED was still holding to a queried date of ante 1513 in a quote by Scottish... Whoops, oh, I'm so sorry about this. What is with my slides? In a quote by Scottish poet William Dunbar, "Behis feras he would have fucked." And that's still their first official record of one use of their word, though you'll see, and we'll talk about in a moment, they have an ante 1500 that they've added later in brackets. We'll talk about that in a moment. And yet they say the word is most likely derived from, inherited from Germanic, which would position the word fuck at the earliest moment in the history of English. So they were fucking before the 16th century. What did they call it? Well, Middle English also had a curious verb called sweven, to sweeve, which meant the same thing. But older than that is simply the word fuck. The OED actually had this wrong for a long time, because of course they did. Because they only can work with the evidence that they have. And that, for the most part, is the evidence that the most learned and usually prim or priestly conservators deigned to preserve for posterity. But when you see one of these little flags, here's the little flag I want to tell you about. Sometimes you'll see a little flag at the top of an OED entry, right next to the V. When you see one of those flags, always click on it. Here we get in process, oops, sorry, my bad. Here we get some in-process commentary on the OED that mentions the infamous F word, which may sometimes have had the general sense of just to hit or to strike in early usage, though I'm not sure I buy that. But that is witnessed as far back as 1287. Then we click further into the etymology on the list, in this definition. And they acknowledge here that in 1310, right, sometimes it's used in a sense that they believe is to strike or to beat, though I wonder about that. But when we have a sort of fake name that's inserted in a record, the surname here, it is perhaps possible that the sexual sense is shown in the surname fuck by the navel. Sorry. In 1310. They acknowledge that the assumedly joking surname that has somehow found its way into a record in the year 1310, the name is Roger Fuck by the Navel, is using the word as we would, a full 2 centuries earlier in 1310 than had been previously acknowledged. Notice that this guy, Roger, is surely a prankster. He's planted a little linguistic time bomb that careful curators perhaps missed until recently. A way of speaking across the centuries to say, hey fucker, I was here too. But he's not the only one. An entry, sorry, I'm going to ask them to... In fact, you'll see here, in the second transitive, right, to have sexual intercourse with, parenthesis, a person. In brackets, we have a somewhat new edition, Ante 1500. This is actually added to the OED, I believe, after I started teaching this class, and I haven't been alive that long. This is what we call a quotation from a macaronic verse. Right, I'll actually move it to the side so you can see me talking about it. Yes. Okay, here we are. A macaronic verse. That is poetry that code switches between Latin and English. So you see here, right here, non sunt in coeli, quia something, right? So non sunt in caeli, or coeli, means they are not in heaven. Quia, right? So the group of monks that the poem is mocking, they are not in heaven. Quia, because, that's Latin again. And then they give us what? Oh, it's a code. This is the earliest reference, or one of the earliest references we get to the word, right? Which, if you move each of those letters one place back in the medieval alphabet, so you take the G and move it back to F. You take the X and move it back not to W or V, because those are not consistently used, but rather back to U, which is the same letter as W and V. You get F, U, DD becomes CC, FU, CC, and so forth, giving you what the OED helpfully decodes. Sorry for the slides here, I didn't really do this right. As Fukant Wives, UUIUYS, of Ely. That is, the monks are not in heaven because they fuck the wives of Ely. That is, the women of Ely, which is a town in England. Notice that the English fuck is given an affix here, fuckant, but it definitely, and that's a Latin affix, but it definitely is code switching in literal code, which I love, to get another fuck under the radar by the clerical keepers and later the keepers of text that are concerned with propriety. This one is directly used in anti-clergy mockery, as fucking was the one thing that the Catholic clergy, like the monks being criticized here, were not supposed to do. But many medieval mockers suggested that that rule was often broken. The difference between what was legal and what was possible. But unless you sneak it in, the written record tends to record only what was legal and proper. So if we're going to correct our perspective here, we should be continuing to ask, what else didn't sneak by? Or rather, what else didn't sneak by? All right. Moving from there, sorry for the wonky slides on this one. What about man parts? You've just read A Talk of 10 Wives on Their Husbands' Wear. This is what the poem's editor has to say. I'm just reading the highlighted part. In euphemistic language, think about what euphemism means. In euphemistic language worthy of distinction, for the number of words describing but never saying the word penis, 10 married women take turns talking frankly about the shortcomings of their husband's merchandise. She continues from there to say, despite the fact that this is probably a male-authored text mocking the hubris of an assumed male privilege, on which more in a moment. Now, I mean no disrespect here to the excellent editor of this text. It's an excellently edited text, but think about what it is to treat this dick joke poem that you read as something euphemistic, as something shy about actually saying penis, because that's dirty talk, that's inappropriate to be written down. Is that the poem you read? Of course they don't say penis. Penis is an inkhorn term. It's a polite, early modern invention borrowed from the Latin for tail, first recorded in medical texts in 1578. There is nothing reserved, shy, or euphemistic about this text that you've just read, except the assumptions about the past that we bring to it. Assumptions mobilized by the partial view of the past that euphemistic historians and early modern inkhorners have given us. There was no distinction between 1500 between polite and impolite terms for dick. And the wives in this poem run the gamut of the words available to them. They say cock in fidecock, which the OED dates only to 1618, but the usage is clearly in use beforehand, given this poem and other examples, though the OED now hedges its bets and says it comes up in compounds. So, okay. Right. So here, fidecock uses cock, which is a term we're familiar with, but the OED generally says only in 1618. Uses tarse and pintle, which have been in use since the Old English period. The polite words that the editor uses to gloss them, penis and member, are much younger terms, which come into English in 1578 from Latin and slightly before 1300 from French. Interestingly, piss, which I wouldn't guess was a French borrowing, piss comes in from Anglo-Norman as well. So, what does it teach me? I'm a cis man. To give me the idea that referring euphemistically to a penis is an older phenomenon than it is. To give me the sense that the idea that the penis is unspeakable is something that has always been the case, or been the case for the whole time we've spoken English. Rather than in actuality, the roots of the language I speak began by fully acknowledging, unshamefully, that penises exist, and that there's no proper or improper word to refer to them. The issue is far more urgent for people who have vaginas, in which the body shaming supposedly inherent to English-speaking culture may not be as timeless as you may think. I quote here from one of my favorite Middle English plays, The Castle of Perseverance, in which the character lechery, the personification of the idea of lechery, is perceived as a very straightforward woman who invites the main character, man, to creep into her cunt. You see the word all in medical treatises in the medieval period and punned on freely by Chaucer. It just means what it means. But the word cunt now registers as unspeakable, as an expletive. So much so that in 2018, to take one example among many, the general unapologetic feminist Samantha Bee had to tweet out an apology to Ivanka Trump because she had dared to use this inappropriate, inexcusable word to refer to her. I crossed a line, and I deeply regret it. What does it mean for Samantha Bee or for Ivanka Trump to believe that a word that once simply just referred to a part of their bodies is inexcusable, unspeakable? I'm sure you've already guessed that the idea that the C word is unspeakable, horrible, well, except among drunken British dudes, can only occur after 1500, once the inkhorners come up with a tidy little Latin borrowing that is restricted primarily to those medical professionals and defenders of propriety who have the most access to Latin learning in the early modern period. You know, early modern men. So by 1682, those men give us a proper, polite usage that's beginning to restrict itself to the word vagina, which is a Latin borrowing from the Latin for sheath, for scabbard, an object whose sole purpose is to be the holder of a phallic weapon. That is what the word vagina means, a sheath for a sword. I will pass the mic here to a woman's voice, lesbian feminist writer Inga Muschio, whose excellent and entertaining book, and the book is titled Cunt, A Declaration of Independence, makes the strong and moving case, this is the book if you want to know more, strong and moving case for reclaiming the word cunt and for dropping the word vagina from lesbian feminist use altogether. She'll be asking you to say the word vagina along with her. It's up to you whether you want to do so at home. She writes, on the choice occasions popes and politicians directly refer to female genitalia, the term vagina is discreetly engaged. If you will be so kind, say vagina out loud a few times. Go ahead. Strip away the meaning and listen solely to the phonetic sound. It resonates from the roof of your mouth. Vagina. A vagina could, she's talking about the sound of the word. A vagina could be an economy car. That's right, Wanda. Come within $500 of the actual sticker price and you'll win this, a brand new Chrysler vagina. Or a rodent. Next on Prairie Safari, you'll see a wily little silver-tailed vagina outwit a ferocious pair of ospreys. Moving from phonetics to etymology, vagina originates from a word meaning sheath for a sword. Ain't got no vagina. Which brings us to slurs. Sorry, going through some slides here. Which brings us to slurs and to the work of Carolyn Dinshaw. You're a Lollard. Well, you're a sodomite. What do these Middle English words and post-Middle English words mean in practice? In the margins, as I seem to hear be in the margins, these are older slides, of what has been written down and preserved. Notice in Dinshaw's notes here, the semantic etymology of Lollard. Initially a term of disapprobation that seems to be picked up and used by the disapproved themselves. It used to just mean lazy ass. But followers of John Wycliffe, a major critic of the church, found people calling them a derogatory term, you Lollards, and they reclaim the term as their own, as a point of pride. It becomes their word. Sound familiar? The semantic shift of reclaiming slurs is as old as Middle English, unlike the separation of polite and impolite words for your body. Though it takes a textual scholar with an eye as keen as Dinshaw's to be able to decode it from between the lines of what gets written down and preserved. This is important. I know that Dinshaw was quite dense, but what Dinshaw is doing is revealing information embedded and encoded in texts that modern readers had previously not noticed, that show us how the language is working, and how when someone is called a Lollard or called a sodomite, there's actually a pretty complex and flexible set of semantic fluid meanings around those terms that don't mean what you may think. Dinshaw continues, parody appropriation, don't only mean what you may think. She writes, parody, this is another note of hers, these are both notes 1 and 44. Parody appropriation is characteristic of Lollard discourse. Lollards themselves appropriated the pejorative term loller for their own use. At the same time as the Lollards are increasingly persecuted, the reclaimed term Lollard undergoes further semantic generalization. So Marjorie Kemp, whose views are about as un-Lollard as they get, Lollards famously believe that priests should not be trusted, or priests should not have to be middlemen for scripture, and that the body of Christ does not really inhere in the bread at Mass. Marjorie Kemp loves priests. She adores priests. She always goes to priests, and specifically she so believes that the bread is the body of Christ that she actually sees it bleeding and sees flesh in it. So she's about as un-Lollard as they get, but she gets called a Lollard by her haters some decades after Wycliffe, which baffles her. How could I be a Lollard? But it's because the reclaimed term has begun to mean, more broadly, more generally, anyone outside the norm, particularly the religious norm, which Marjorie was. Like the term sodomite or modern slurs for gay people, to refer back to Dinshaw, right? The term becomes, and I'm going to quote here, the term becomes a plastic agglutinative accusation, one that can be thrown back onto the accusers who initially said it, performing important functions for both the orthodox and the heterodox. It's a collector, right? Much like present-day slurs for gay people, to mean anything bad, anything outside a perceived norm. But when nearly all our evidence of past practices, past language practices, is written and then copied, preserved, bowdlerized, euphemized, or simply trashed or deleted by the often exclusive and often exclusionary early modern and present-day keepers of language history, and when they were only copied down into preservable writing by members of the clergy, we find that we, like Muschio, like Dinshaw, and like those encoded fuckers of the OED, must use none other than our best close reading skills to hone in on a language for our bodies and for our bodies' functions and for our sexualities that is truly our own. I promised that this class would fuck with what you take for granted a little, making you better able to perceive nuance in the words used around you, including language ostensibly used or not used to protect or shield or sheath you from a history that is supposedly always more repressive the further back you go, a story that is told by repressive historians more than it is told by history. I hope that there are at least a few words by the end of term that you'll never hear or refuse to hear the same again.